Thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Hello cinephiles! I've often wondered, why is it that Stanley Kubrick's visual style seems to stand out as one of cinema's most interesting eyes for storytelling?
Mandrake, have you never wondered why?
I think in order to answer this question, we must go back to when Kubrick's style was first beginning to form.
I'm at roughly 1414 Shakespeare Avenue in the Bronx, New York. This is where Stanley Kubrick grew up. You can see that this is a big apartment building. I'm pretty sure he grew up in a house. His family was pretty wealthy, but there's no 1414 Shakespeare Avenue anymore. Instead, there's this big, giant apartment building. But on these streets here, this is where a young 13-year-old Stanley Kubrick would go around and take pictures with his brand new Graflex camera.
Kubrick's unique style was formed in his photography. Today, we are going to take a journey around New York City, where much of Kubrick's photographic work for Look magazine was captured, to see if we can recreate some of his photos. We'll take a look at some of his photographic techniques that would later help him as a filmmaker, and we'll look at his influences and hear his thoughts on photography in order to better understand how Kubrick became one of the most visual filmmakers in cinema history.
And it was a case of, over a period of, say, from the age of 13 to 17, you might say, going through step by myself without anybody really helping me, the problem solving of becoming a photographer. And I found that, I think in looking back, that this particular thing about problem solving is something that schools generally don't teach you, and that if you can develop a kind of generalized approach to problem solving, it's surprising how it helps you in anything.
As Alexandra von Stosch and Rainier Crone point out in their essay titled Kubrick's Kaleidoscope, Kubrick's street photography style was built on a universal observation in which the person viewing the photo could very well be someone who stumbled upon the scene. A single frame and a continuous action or story that extends forwards and backwards in the viewer's mind. Just look at this photo. It feels like you can really understand this woman's personality without even seeing her face. She walks confidently, shoulders back. The camera seems to be at a slightly low angle, and her path is pretty clear of obstacles. This looks like a woman who has just completed a goal.
This is where Kubrick took that photo. If you look right behind me, you can see Grand Central Station all the way in the back there. And what's really interesting is the facade. It's a little bit different, but a lot of it's the same. This molding here is all the same as it was in the 40s.
The little glass circles embedded in the sidewalk are no longer there, but they still exist elsewhere in the city. These were there to let sunlight into basements that housed factories before they used electricity.
And if you take a look at the outtakes of that photo series, it looked like Kubrick was kind of following this woman from behind and kind of snapped a couple of different photos. And a lot of them had motion blur on them, but there was that one that looks really great. So we're going to try and recreate that right now with this Yashica Mat. It's a medium format camera. And we'll see how we do.
I've enlisted my friend Sophie to help me recreate these photos. She's walking the same path as the woman in the picture, and I'll try to frame it the same way. Kubrick worked for Look magazine between 1946 and 1951. In 1971, Look closed its doors. The magazine could no longer compete with television. The archives of all the photos Kubrick took for the magazine, including the tens of thousands of photos that Kubrick submitted that ultimately didn't get published, were sent to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., and tucked away into storage. Kubrick had around 900 of his photos published in the magazine, but there were still a very large amount of unpublished photos that would continue to go unseen by the public until the end of the 90s. In 1998, a team from the Institute of Art History at Munich's Ludwig Maximilian University realized during a seminar on Kubrick's movies that no one had written on Kubrick's photos because there wasn't a simple way to access them. At this time, Kubrick himself expressed interest in finding these photos, as he had no negatives or prints from his time at Look magazine. There was a law from the 1940s that photographers had to give all negatives to their employer, and had no copyright for the photos they were commissioned to take. The researchers started by combing through old issues of Look to find Kubrick's published photo series, and in 1999, the first exhibition of Kubrick's photography was open to the public. This is the Museum of the City of New York, where they have archived almost 16,000 negatives of Kubrick's photos. You can browse all of them for free at mcny.org. There's a ton of great stuff here. I love that you can see all of the outtakes and really get a sense of Kubrick's process. If you find yourself in New York City in the summer of 2018, the Museum of the City of New York will have an exhibition of Kubrick's photography starting in May. Kubrick's photographic style evolved into some of the greatest cinematography in film history. So let's take a look at 3 photographers who greatly influenced the formation of Kubrick's style and storytelling sensibilities. One of Kubrick's favorite photographers was Henri CartierBresson, who has been called one of the pioneers of street photography. He called the art of photography capturing a decisive moment. The decisive moment refers to his hunt for the perfect fleeting moment to capture an image. He said that facts aren't interesting. Taking a photograph simply to report isn't interesting. Rather, you must evoke something. He would often frame an image and just sit and wait for something interesting to happen.
Well, I saw the frame of the whole thing and I waited for somebody to pass. And I snapped 2 pictures. One was an Orthodox priest with his cylinder hat and the little girl. Well, the little girl was exactly the thing in relation with the other shapes, whereas him it was something clumsy, it was another conception.
This heavily influenced Kubrick's filmmaking. He would have the cast completely in costume, the crew ready to shoot, and then he would have them run through the scene while he walked around with a viewfinder. When he finally found an interesting angle or staging, he would begin shooting. While working on pre-production for One-Eyed Jacks, Kubrick wanted to hire Bresson to shoot stills on the set, but the star of the film, Marlon Brando, refused. Kubrick would eventually leave the film after a falling out with Brando. Another photographic influence of Kubrick's that I touched on in the previous video was Ouija. Kubrick did get to enlist Ouija to shoot stills on the set of Dr. Strangelove. Ouija's photography often utilized a flash or other harsh light, which, quote, made the background night scenery seem even darker. Kubrick used a similar lighting style for his boxing series. Ouija's photos have a brutal, sensational quality to them. Ouija would follow ambulances and police cars in order to take photos of crime scenes and accidents. There's a certain amplification of reality, and we get the sense that we are looking at something that we shouldn't. We can see this style reflected in the more exaggerated moments of Kubrick's films. Kubrick was influenced by Bresson and Ouija's photos, but instead of trying to capture truly candid images like they did, Kubrick would recognize what would be interesting, and often try to compose that image in a somewhat controlled fashion. We are seeing Kubrick's wholly subjective view of reality, shaped and constructed by Kubrick himself. Like Bresson and Ouija, Kubrick's images aren't simply reportage. They aren't just a snapshot of what's happening, but rather these photos tell stories and comment on our world.
I try to humanize the news story. Of course, I ran into snags with the dopey editors. If it was a fire, they'd say, "Where's the burning building?" I says, "Look, they all look alike." I says, "Look, here's the people affected by the burning building."
Bresson's photos show the ephemeral nature of time and memory, and Ouija's photos reveal the seedy underbelly of post-war America. Kubrick's photos feel larger than life, at once both realistic and hyper-stylized. We can see this in his films as well. Another strong photographic influence for Kubrick was the work of Diane Arbus. Arbus is most well known for photos of people on the fringes of society. While Ouija sensationalized the strange, Arbus seemed to bring out a familiarity in it. There's a normalcy that exists in the strange, as well as a strangeness that exists in normalcy. Stosch and Crone note a great example of this concept in a particular photo of Kubrick's that depicts a business that sells artificial limbs. Instead of highlighting the abnormality of missing limbs, Kubrick instead focuses on the business aspect of it. And in a time directly following World War II, this was a profitable business to be in. A freakish yet familiar quality exists in most of Kubrick's projects. This appears quite a bit in AI, which Kubrick developed. We can also see a direct influence of Arbus in The Shining. Arbus took this photo in 1967 of identical twins in New Jersey, with what else but a Rolleiflex twin-lens reflex camera.
Come and play with us, Daddy.
Even as early as his time at Look magazine, there exists what would become one of his most important cinematic philosophies, that of ambiguity. In an interview with Robert Emmett Ginna, Kubrick said, "It has always seemed to me that really artistic, truthful ambiguity, if we can use such a paradoxical phrase, is the most perfect form of expression, for a number of reasons. One, nobody likes to be told anything. Nobody likes to be told the truth about what's happening. And perhaps even more important than that, nobody knows what is true or what is happening. I think that a really perfect ambiguity is something which means several things, all of which might be true and which at the same time move the audience emotionally in the general direction you want them to be moving. So I think that conversely, the literal, plain, clear statement is in its own way a false statement and never has the power that a perfect ambiguity might. This is likely most prominent in 2001: A Space Odyssey, but Kubrick heavily utilizes ambiguity in nearly all of his films. I spoke of Kubrick's subway series in the previous video. These photos were quite difficult to take, because he had to shoot at a slower shutter speed to compensate for the low lighting. He would frame his shot and wait for the train to stop, so the shot would be somewhat steady, but often someone would walk in front of him or the subject would leave the train. He used a Contax and shot at 1/8 of a second. He also tripled the development time to make it brighter. Kubrick was just about 18 years old when he took these photos, and there was a funny interaction with a subway guard. The guard asked him if he had permission to shoot down in the subway, and he said, "I'm from Look." The guard replied, "Yeah, Sonny, and I'm the society editor of the Daily Worker." As you can see, he took tons and tons of photos for this series. I rode the subway with this camera. This is a Kodak Pony 135C. This is a fully manual camera from the 50s. You can't even see the focus when you're shooting. You have to guess how far away your subject is and then just dial it in. So I tried to take some photos the way Kubrick did on the subway. I used Tri-X with a 400 ISO and tripled the development time, which I have never done before. The subway cars are much better lit now than they were in the 40s, so I used a shutter speed of 1/50th of a second or 1/100th of a second to cut down on the motion blur. Kubrick took quite a lot of subway photos that didn't make it into the magazine. I mentioned in the previous video, Kubrick would take many photos so that he would have more choice when narrowing down to the best shots. This likely began his practice of shooting many takes of a scene, but there's an interesting story that highlights another reason for this. Before working full-time at Look, Kubrick and a high school friend named Bernard Cooperman went to take pictures at a baseball stadium for a freelance assignment. Cooperman gave some insight into Kubrick's early process in an interview with Vincent Labruto. He said, "I had no idea of what to do. I mean, I was going to take pictures of a baseball game. What Kubrick did was he just sat in front of a group of 3 or 4 kids facing the camera. They made faces at him and he just sat there until they finally forgot that he was there, and he got great pictures." This makes sense with his tendency to shoot many takes. At first, the subjects may be self-conscious and unable to relax in front of the camera, but after a while they become used to it and are able to behave in a more natural way. Thanks to the archive at the Museum of the City of New York, we can see all the outtakes Kubrick had to choose from while creating this photo. This is from a series on a showgirl named Rosemary Williams. Here we see a woman with what some would consider a sinful profession, praying in a church. Kubrick almost always shot only with whatever light was available at the location he was photographing, but when it came to filmmaking, he would light the scenes in a stylized yet realistic way. This photograph has a very interesting chiaroscuro lighting style, but the light was likely found like this in the location. From what I've read about his photography style, this photo was most likely posed. Kubrick probably saw the way the light fell and had the subjects pose under it. We can see a similar harsh overhead lighting style repeated in The Killing.
This is Columbia University in New York City. For the May 11, 1948 issue of Look magazine, this was one of Kubrick's biggest photo projects for the magazine. You can see he actually did a whole photo essay here, and it included pictures of then General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Of course, Eisenhower would eventually become president.
Eisenhower was president of Columbia University from 1948 to 1953. The Look issue was on him becoming head of the university. Kubrick couldn't get into Columbia because of his low grades from high school, and so soon after graduating, he was working for Look and taking pictures at the campus of a man who would become president of the United States. Here's an interesting article about Kubrick from the May 11, 1948 issue of the magazine. The distinguished faculty members and officials at Columbia University weren't used to being pushed around. So what did this rank teenager mean telling them what to do? Like any experienced photographer, Stanley Kubrick knew exactly what he wanted. The impatient mutterings of dignitaries had long since failed to ruffle this quiet, brown-eyed youngster. For 2 weeks, Stanley stuck to the job on the university campus and got the excellent pictorial story of Columbia that appears with Don Wharton's article on pages 25 through 33. At 19, Stanley is a 2-year veteran on the Look photographic staff. And even before he was graduated from high school in the Bronx in 1946, he sold his candidly shot pictures to Look. When Stanley joined the staff, his fellow photographers were quick to observe his intense preoccupation with his work. In a spirit of friendly cooperation, they formed a Bringing Up Stanley Club, dedicated to reminding Stanley not to forget his keys, glasses, overshoes, and other miscellaneous trivia. The subtle influence of his loosely organized advisory group has also brought an apparent change in the young man's clothing tastes. Once given to wearing teenage trademarks, saddle shoes, lounge jackets, and sports shirts, Stanley now leans toward Glen plaid business suits and white shirts. But his preoccupation with photography is unchanged. In his spare time, Stanley experiments with cinematography and dreams of the day when he can make documentary films. The young fellow may go on forgetting his keys. But photographically, Stanley doesn't need any help in bringing himself up. I'm at Columbia University right now. This is the Kent building. You might recognize these stairs. These were the same stairs that Kubrick took that picture of that woman holding all of the books, trying to carry them down the stairs. So we're going to try and recreate this photo with the Yashica Matte 124G. This is a cheap alternative to Kubrick's Rolleiflex, but it does take photos on 120 film. So let's see how we do. Here are some outtakes from the archive. It looks like it was much earlier in the day than when I found it. The sun is beaming through the window, highlighting the woman. The different framing in these outtakes makes me think that this was very spontaneous, and Kubrick was just clicking away until he got something good. This is Washington Square Park, which you might remember from a previous video. This is where Kubrick used to come and play chess for quarters. He also came back here when he was working on a piece on boxer Walter Cartier. And there's a great photo of Cartier jogging he's kind of framed in between the pillars of the archway. So we're gonna see if we can kind of try to recreate that. There's a lot of clutter here because it's the holidays. But we're gonna try and come up with something similar. Washington Square Park is located in Greenwich Village, and Kubrick moved to Greenwich Village in 1949, just after his first marriage to a woman named Toba Metz. And a side note, Washington Square Park has been featured in many, many movies, TV shows, and even comics. This is the 81st Street station. This is where Kubrick took those photos of his soon-to-be first wife, Toba Metz, and another friend up against this pole right here. We're gonna see if we can use our Yashica Matte to try and recreate this picture, although it's actually pretty dark in here. It also looks like Kubrick may have actually used a light for the shoot. You can see what appears to be a light stand between the subjects in this photo. Seeing how the rest of the platform looks very dark, it makes sense why he would have brought a light. I also really like this picture from a series of photos showing pedestrians outside of the Waldorf Astoria. This is the historic Waldorf Astoria Hotel. You can see behind me there's the big MetLife building back there. That wasn't there in the original picture, it had not yet been built. But we can see in the original picture that the top of the building in front of it is just barely visible. There's also a different awning in the original picture that has since been replaced. So what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and recreate that kind of series of pictures that he did. I believe he kind of hugged this wall over here, and he had his medium format camera. It was a twin lens reflex camera that he could just kind of look down into and just snap photos as the people were walking by. So we're going to try and do that. In an interview, Kubrick spoke on his philosophy of storytelling through images. He said, "The point of view that the work is conveying has to be completely entwined with the sense of life as it is, and has to be transmitted by a subtle injection into the audience's consciousness. The ideas have to be discovered by the audience, and their thrill in making the discovery makes those ideas all the more powerful." This philosophy is the base principle of Kubrick's storytelling method. He never spelled anything out for the audience. Instead, he presented each story in such a way that it required the audience to think about what to make of it. He treated every shot in his films like a photographer. There's care in making sure each shot evokes an idea in the viewer, and most often, this idea is slightly different for each person. I believe this is why Kubrick's stories will remain timeless. Thanks for watching, and a special thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Skillshare is an online learning community with more than 17,000 classes in photography, filmmaking, and more. This is a very special partnership for me because I actually started using Skillshare almost 4 years ago, taking classes from experts in writing short films and learning Adobe Premiere Pro, which I use to make these videos. The knowledge I gained from using Skillshare helped get me to a place where they are interested in sponsoring my work. How cool is that? What's really great about Skillshare is that it's both cheaper and better than similar services out there. You can get a premium membership for less than $10 a month for an annual subscription. As you can probably tell, I'm interested in learning about how to shoot on film. I took a great course on film photography by Antonio Castello of Lomography. I think the next class I'm going to take is one on how to develop your own film. I also really like Skillshare's wonderful community aspect. You can communicate with other members and post your class projects and see what other people came up with. It was really cool being able to read everyone's short film scripts once I finished the class. Because Skillshare is sponsoring this video, the first 100 people to use the promo link in the description will get their first 2 months free to try it out, risk-free. Thank you to my wonderful patrons. If you'd like to help the future of this channel, please consider supporting CinemaTyler on Patreon. Available on Patreon right now are the scans of the Columbia photo series by Kubrick, and a special exclusive to patrons are the scans of all the photos I took while making this video. And if you're new here, please hit that subscribe button now because there are plenty more videos on the way for cinephiles like you. Thanks again for watching.